So everybody, thank you for coming. It's a big honor for us. This is a big event for me personally. It's sort of a career highlight as far as public speaking goes. This is Eden. I'm Inbar. We're going to talk about what we call from one country, one floppy to startup nation, retrospective on the 25 Israeli hacking years from the early days of the community until where we are today. And a disclaimer first, because we're going to be talking about hacking, and this is all, recorded and everything. Whenever I say I, or whenever one of us says I, it means one of us. And whenever one of us says we, that means the community, okay? Unless otherwise stated, okay? So if I say we did that, then it's not us, it's because here we're speaking for a big community here. A little bit about us, why we're here. As you can see, I was born in 1975. I got my first computer, was a Dragon 64. It was in 1984. My first PC was an Amstrad PC 1512. That was 88. Joined the military in 93, like most people in Israel. Left the military 18 years later, went to work for Checkpoint, and then for Perimeter X. I'll let Eden.
So we share the Amstrad, and in fact we actually got to know each other when we were 13, and there's a story about that as well. But before moving over to the dark side of being a venture capitalist, I built Eternity, who I sold to Riverbed, and then Face.com, that if you use face recognition on Facebook, that's us.
And why are we here? Every time we meet, we tell war stories. And since we're all relatively old, then we keep covering all the time, since the late 80s, early 90s. And we like telling the war stories, and all of a sudden, DEF CON 25 had a theme that said 25 years of hacking. And I'm like, okay, so let's put it in writing, and let's share it with others. But our story actually starts a long, long time ago. We're not exactly sure. I mean, I started reverse engineering at 14, so that puts it around 1989. But this is all very vague because we're looking back a long time ago.
Some of the people in the story that you'll see during the conversation are pretty interesting, right? The first one, this guy ran the biggest wares site in Israel, one-man crew. This guy I knew only on QSD, X25, as Dire Maker. This guy had BBS along with this guy. And then this, some people know, but he was just hacking around on the Coders channel on IRC. This ran the Lamer Slasher BBS doing some lyrics and copyright infringement at mass. He was, before being arrested 3 times, he was only arrested once. And that's the two of us there, basically around those ages.
You can notice I still have 2 hands there. So that's old. So why one country, one floppy? The percentage back at the time was amazing. It is estimated that 98% of the software in Israel back at the late 80s and early 90s was pirated. And the reason is basically that why not? Because you can. Most of it wasn't really protected. And we liked the challenge when it was protected. And it was sort of a revolt because software was really expensive back then. I mean, today we moved to a situation where what software that used to cost $700 on your PC now costs $5 or $6 on your phone. But back then it was a lot of money, and if you wanted to have a lot of stuff, that was very expensive. You couldn't afford it. So the Middle Eastern mentality and a bunch of other things kind of made it clear to us that no, we're not going to pay for that. We can just, have it.
And talking about mentality, and we'll end the presentation also with this at some 60 slides for now. So the Israel culture, you need to, just to give you the background, Israel culture is disrespect for authority. That's the biggest, single most thing. When my son tells me, no, that's not smart, go fill the tub, and I'll then stop playing the iPad, I'm actually proud, right? So, and willingness to fail is a huge thing. And then just constantly, and that's what you see most entrepreneurs do. Live today as there might be no tomorrow. That's another aspect of kind of the Israel culture. And if you look at the US, you have a 1% of the population that can write the book. Can you talk into the microphone? Yes, I will talk into the microphone. So you have 1% of the population in the US that can write the book, and then 99% that actually follow what it's written there. In Israel, 40% can write the book, and then 60% don't listen. So, period of time that we're talking about, this is the late 80s, early 90s. A great period. And it's a great period because of a few things. The first is, this is the Israeli computer law that was passed 1995. So, at that time, there's no law whatsoever. You can do anything you want. And the second is, during that time, the phone system did not have any filters, right? So, we could basically do whatever that we wanted. And it was a very, very, very slow internet.
So this is the logo of the National Phone Company. Funny as it may sound, it was actually officially formed in 1982 as a government-owned company. And because of being a government-owned company, there was a lot of conflict going there. Not everybody agreed on what they should do. It actually only started operating in 1984. The country was formed in 1948, so you can, you know. The concept of mess is going to be around this conversation, this talk, so that's one of the things we're going to show you. On the right, you can see the token-operated payphones. These were later switched for plastic cards, but we started with the tokens. On the left, you can see the rotary dial. Everybody had those. And it took a long time before we switched over to tone dial, which is the one you see in the middle. A very long time, and this is going to come up in this talk as well. Many of the things you will see in this talk are actually from our private collections. I wouldn't say we hoard, but we collect stuff from those days, and this is a scan that I actually made 5 days ago. I actually have the floppies. They were actually working. I just moved 4 months ago, and I hired a company that also did the packing, and they put the floppies together with the speakers. So I guess, yes, thank you for your support. So this is about as much as I can get. This is the floppy that we were using to communicate with some of the services of the phone company. Now, before we continue, I want to talk a little bit about terminology, because back then it was not exactly as it is today. We had 4 common terms when we considered the hacking community. We had the hacking, cracking, phreaking, and carding. Now, hacking was the act of, going into somebody else's system. That's it. I suppose everybody recognizes that. Cracking was the act of removing protections, almost always copy protections. We copied games. Games came with codes or sheets of numbers that you needed. We didn't like that. There was some tougher copy protections like laser holes in the floppy. So anything dealing with removing the protection, that was cracking. Phreaking was any hacking on the phone system, but most commonly to make phone calls without paying. And carding was using credit cards that were not yours. So here's an example. We start with phreaking. As I mentioned before, it took a while before the phone company switched over to tone dial. When that happened, most of the payphones were still token operated. So if you brought one of those little devices, this is actually a remote control from old days answering machines with cassettes. So it's a remote controller. You could call home, get the machine to answer you, then you punch in a code, you can check for messages. But this is normal DTMF. So if you just pick up the receiver of the payphone and use DTMF to dial, then you can make a phone call without paying, right? Call waiting. So that's very annoying when you have a modem, because it actually drops the carrier tone. We had a lot of problem with that, and one of the creative solution we had, early in the day, we had call forwarding as well. Well, it turns out that the phone company didn't do any contingencies, and it turned out that you could do call forwarding to your own number. So what happened was that in the beginning, it crashed the phone company. We have a friend that told us the story. His trunk crashed. The phone company actually reached out to him, and they fixed it, but the trick still worked later.
First recursion. Yeah. So we were using phones, and in the phones, the first thing that you do is you actually, after hacking it through, but you want to use the BBS scene. And you need to realize that BBS, just in general, just the phone cost was immense. It was $3 a minute to call the US from Israel. So everything was local. It was a local ecosystem, even though it was a very, very small system. Actually, Bezeq, that same phone company, told us and disapproved the importing of 9600 baud modems because they said they would burn the phone lines. Seriously. So we had to smuggle 9600 baud modems from the US in carry-ons. Much like every war, it's a small community, so it's like we have less than 100 people with BBSs, but there are already two groups there, the XLNet and the ICCA, that fight each other. And this is a hacking, cracking community, so how do they fight? Is they write software in order to crash the other network's hard drives. So each of those networks is hiring coders in order to create Viri, so they would crash the other ones because they're starting to take money and they don't want to have competition. On the free side, those same people are now rewriting Z modem, B modem, if people here still know them, just not to report the last CRC. Because they didn't want the files to be counted. So you would download the whole file, but not report the last byte, the last CRC of the byte, and then that wouldn't be counted. So you have a bunch of people trying to hack through, and that creates the first instances of the copyright people or the Wares software, right? So LyricsIn is by Yaniv Teigman, the CTO of Face.com, the one that sold to Facebook. And he puts in the repository, the world's biggest repository of lyrics, but Israel doesn't have not the computer law and very relaxed also copyright laws. So that becomes the biggest repository that then moves over to the internet. But we still do infighting. So Ultinet and CNET are the two first networks in Israel, and each hate each other for both free, but have different value systems. So they also want the other ones to crash. And so these were the infightings.
Another front of fighting was the ANSI screens. These, as you can see, this is one of the things that I found in my repository of all the old stuff that I collected. I don't have an old machine anymore. This was actually, I ran a VM of XP, I think it was, and VDraw. Who remembers VDraw? All right, we have some people in the crowd here. So that was a program you used to create ANSI screens, and you could do animation. And the BBSs competed for who has the nicer animation or who was making fun of the other ones as well. And as Eden mentioned before, the rivalry made it far. This actually says...
There's a good amount of Hebrew speakers here, I see.
Yes, it says you're an SOB. This is recorded, so I'll be gentle. When you were trying to con your way into improving your download ratio, or maybe, you know...
Rewriting B modem and
rewriting B modem or Z modem, or maybe your username was suddenly associated with the other group, then you received a warm welcome.
And so you have many people that are trying to, there's a lot of mess going on, and many groups, and so the only option at that point, I'm 13, Inbar is 14 at the time, and we meet at my place, and we say there are too many people and there's too much fighting going on, what do we need to do? We need to move from the techies world to the organized world, right? Organized. So the only sensible thing, being 13, is we need to take over the network. So how do you do that when you're 13? You start a council. You convince people that you need a council because there's all this infighting going on. But obviously someone needs to guard the council, right? So you need an ethics committee. Meet the ethics committee. And it's the early intro how you run company board of directors. Also, some of the prominent people at that time, actually the second member of the ethics committee is a guy called Eran Tromer in RSA, the Shamir, the S. So the protege of Shamir is Eran Tromer, who was that early participant in the ethics committee. So many of those people started building also more of a community around them.
So just to give you a small example of what the community was like back then, despite the fights, despite the rivalries, we were a community, mostly because we were all geeks and we were outcasts to a certain extent, some more than others, but there was a community. There was this feeling that we are all part of a bigger thing. And every now and then we would have CSOP meetings. All the BBS owners would meet at the house of one of the participants, Everybody would go there. We would talk. Eden and I would, run things, the ethics committee, whatever. And on one of those meetings, that was in the north of Israel. I used to live south of Tel Aviv. And on the way back, we were on the train. And it was a rainy day. It was winter. And the roof was leaking. So we were like 3 people. We had to switch cars, went to another car. Of course, it was crowded. So we ended up sitting at a table with a beautiful girl and her mother. Now, back then, I wasn't yet able to hit on girls in front of their mothers. That is no longer the case, but back then it was a problem. I was 17 or 18. So all I could do was try to get as much information as I could. The trip ended with me knowing 4 things about that girl. I knew her first name, I knew what grade she was on, I knew what city she lived in, and I knew the name of her mother. Now this is Friday afternoon. I get home and I frantically write a message on the Echo Mail to all my friends in the north. This is what I know. Help me find that girl. Within less than 24 hours, I had her phone number. Swear to God. Now, sadly, she had a boyfriend, which does not decrease any of the achievement. And as a little anecdote, I actually found her on Facebook a few weeks ago, and apparently she remembers the story, and they actually tell it in the family. So it was kind of fun.
So FidoNet, Echomail, right? Remember the thing that actually calls in every night in order to pull email from another node. So this is not the internet. This is not even leased lines. There were calls made multiple times through the night in order to push email towards a certain direction. But we wanted to go global, right? We didn't feel that it makes sense for that small 200 people community in Israel to stay dormant there. So if we're stuck in our little pond, how do we go global, right? And just to frame the reference this is the history of the evolvement of the speed of the internet in the US. And pretty staggering. In 1994, you only had about 50 kilobps, 84, 86 is already still a bit the same speed, another link, 91 already at, I think it's 65, and then 165 in 94. So, to frame that, this is Israel, right? 89, Bezek, that phone company, informs Machba, that's the backbone of the internet in Israel, that they're not able to provide 56 kilobps to the US for at least the next 10 months. And so they do the backup and they do a 9.6 kilobps to the US. Wonderful. 91, Bezek gets an order for 64K to Europe. 7 months later, there is that first line to Europe. Then just 92, the first ISPs happened in Israel. Up until that point, the only way to get onto the internet was hack into the universities or be a student. And the second is be part of the multinational. So 92, first ISPs, 95, the first bankrupt ISPs. 93, the line to the US has been upgraded to 128. Wonderful. So we need to take care of ourselves.
So one of the things that we wanted to do was, meet other people. And CompuServe was one of the leading platforms back then. I don't know how many of you remember that. And CompuServe was a paid service. So it turned out that in order to access CompuServe, you can sign up for a temporary account. You need to give your credit card number and a billing address. And you get a temporary account for, I think it was 30 days?
30 days.
30 days. And after 30 days, you start, being charged for that. It turns out that when you enter the credit card information, it doesn't get billed immediately. What they do is they just check the Loon Mod 10 formula. So if you take a credit card number, a valid credit card number, and you make some alterations, you can still generate a card number that doesn't exist, but validate the formula. So what we would do is we would make up credit card numbers and then get an account for 30 days. 30 days later, when they figured they couldn't charge the account, they closed it, and then we repeated that again.
Yeah, I think at one point we were the largest consumers of the evaluation accounts of CompuServe in the world.
Oh, and eventually CompuServe deleted or canceled the reverse billing, because when we were accessing CompuServe, we weren't paying. So they stopped that from Israel.
Yeah, what a surprise. And you laugh, right? This is 25 years back, but a very good friend of mine, Sam Lesson, had started his company called Fin just recently, as of last year. And for the alpha, he went to his friends. And he said, hey, would you want to test it out? But I want to see that you have value. And so I'm asking for credit cards from the get-go. And I'm thinking, oh, I know Sam. He's an MVP type of a guy. Okay. He probably didn't implement the billing code just yet. He did do the CRC check. You reverse the last 4 digits, you reverse the last two groups, works. And maybe I'll use this stage to apologize to Sam that I haven't been paying for the past year. But it's a great service, try it out.
Another way to call BBSs in other countries was using calling cards. Back then, you would get a card that was loaded with minutes. You would call a number of an operator. A person would pick it up. You would give them the number. Many years later, it was already all with touch tone, but back then you actually spoke to someone. You said, hi, this is card number 12345. And you said, yes, where should I connect you? And you would give them a number. It turns out that some of the people that were operators, and I just put AT&T because that's the image I found, but I'm pretty sure this was correct for other carriers as well, they would make a note of the calling card number and then later share it with their friends. So people were making phone calls on somebody else's expense. Now, back then, OPSEC was not a term yet. We didn't know anything about that. And we used those things to call BBSs, friends. I mean, if anyone had investigated that, that wouldn't be a big challenge because it's all traceable. But back then, there was no awareness on any of the involved authorities. Okay, so I guess you can say we were taking advantage of the situation and we were kind of lucky.
So it's a story we didn't intend to share, but I totally forgot that. So what you could do, you'd call this toll-free number, say AT&T, right? And you'd give them a calling card number, and they'd say, well, that's an invalid number. And there was a different prefix for the MCI ones and the AT&T ones. It's like, oh, you're right. Can you transfer me to MCI? And they said, sure. And they transfer you. And then in MCI, you just said, can you just bill me? And that'd be billing AT&T because AT&T transferred the call, which that worked for a full 2 months. Anyway, so you kind of remember these things after a while. So no filters meant the obvious thing, right? You all know Captain Crunch. So $3 per minute is just too expensive. So what do? If we do blue boxing, there are two things. It's cheap, meaning zero, and then it's also untraceable because you hoop between multiple switchboards. And so what you see here, this is the CCITT dock. CCITT5 still had in-band trunking, in-band signaling. So you would call up a trunk, you'd call up a number, and you could signal the trunk. Initially just the 2600, then 2426. So it went on to multiple combinations, but what you did have is people that are willing to borrow books from the different switchboards. So you'd know the different signalings that they were using. So this is 92. See the dock? Far, far, far after the US did not have blue boxing working. And in 92, what you see there is a call out to Amos Kilon. Amos Kilon was the runner, he was the sysop of Net1, which was another big ware site in Israel. So Amos Kilon is just a name in Hebrew. It's like Justin, right? So years later, I finally realized I can't find Amos Kilon. So that was an alias. But for a while, it was not that clear. So 92, he was leading the blue boxing in Israel. And basically Mid and South America were controlled by the Israel freakers. So Cuba, full control for a very long time. There was no, for 2-3 years. You would call the 177 number, which is the 800 number that would get you to the operator over there, and you could signal at that point. And from that point on, you are a switchboard yourself, and you can call basically anywhere.
So other than the actual calling, of BBSs, there was a pre-internet network. It was called the X25. It's a packet switching data network that ran across the entire world, and every country had its own prefix. Here you can see a list of country prefixes. Israel was 4251. Funny thing is, there was very little in Israel that was using that, and in any case, if it was in Israel, we didn't need X25 to access it, so we didn't actually remember that this was the code for Israel. We do remember other networks in the United States, for example, 3106, 3110, and that was the pretty much equivalent of IP address. It was called the NUA, Network User Address, and the most, I think, prominent, I guess you can call it site, because back then it wasn't called that, was QSD. QSD was a chat server.
Anyone here remembers QSD? Anyone was on QSD?
All right.
Yeah.
Shout out for you guys. So QSD was a chat server in France. Something like IRC, a little bit more sophisticated at the time. And everybody would hang out there, talk to one another. That was the trading arena. You would find people, you would trade stuff with them. You would get codes or whatever it is that you were trading. And this is the NUA. We remember that by heart. Wake me up at 2 a.m. I will recite that number. And yeah, that most of what we did revolved around QSD. And these are...
what about NUIs? That was really simple.
Okay, NUI. So this is not in the presentation, but we're going to talk about that. Thank you for reminding me, Eden. NUI, the network user identity, is how you logged on to the network. And back then, in Israel at least, there was a number, a dial-up number, you would call it. I think it was like 133 or 135, something like that. And then you had to log in. And there was no login and password. You know what we call today two-factor authentication? That's a three-factor authentication. You have a name or a logon, and you have a password, and then you have another thing. Back then, it was just a logon. And we discovered that some of them had a pattern. So we wrote scripts over some of the telecommunication programs, such as Telex or Procom Plus, if you remember those, Telecom. And we enumerated on logins because we figured out what the prefix was, which was NBasic, and then a code, a 6-digit code. And it turns out that these codes were actually technician codes. So no one was being billed for that, and no one ever found out about it. So that's one part of the story. And what you're seeing now is a list of out dials. These were actually modems connected to the X25 network. They would have an NUA, and when you connected to them, you ended up having a terminal of a modem, which enabled you to dial a local number. So the list that you see in the bottom, those are local out dials. There was one for every area code in the United States, and probably other places as well, but back then the United States was where everybody was looking up to. And you can see that for every area code, you had a couple or sometimes even 4 out dials changing in connection speeds. And we also had global out dials. These were actually modems that had an international phone line. Now, till this very day, I have no idea who was paying for that, because local calls back in the US were not being charged. So I can understand why someone would put a system and connect it to the entire world, but a global out dial was a modem that could call anywhere in the world. One of the things that we could do with that, for example, is call Israel or harass neighbors or, whatever.
Inbar is being too nice to Bezic. So the first codes were NBasic 000001. That's code number 1. Code number 2 was 2, 3. So these died fairly quickly. The other ones less so. So that was kind of X25. How does the internet look like from the eyes of the 13, 14, 15-year-old kids at the time? Because you remember, we don't have any internet, right? We can't buy an ISP account. So this logo is the logo of the Technion, the Israeli Technion. It's located in Haifa. It's very similar to MIT. It's fairly highly regarded. One of the less regarded things there was security at the time. So if you wanted to postpone a class you had or the filing of homework, you could just crash T2. T2 was the students system, but this T2 was actually much worse if you think about security. So at one point it was clear that bin login was actually modified, that it would accept the password fuck you for any user, including root. So just to preserve the rights on that computer. Then interestingly, new users, right, new students, how do you set passwords for new students? Nobody knew how to do it. And so what they decided on is hash. So they hash on their ID number. So your student number was S and then an ID number, and then your default password was a hash on it. They also did not want to publish the results of tests in an identified manner. So they had very big filings of them with the ID number of the student and the mark he got. So you'd go up a bus, it's a 1-2 hours ride, you take photos, analog pictures of the student marks, you go back, you hash it out, and you have the passwords for any student on the T2. Yes. So I wish that was the security. I could tell you this was a really bad security at the time, but Mashbil Merkazi, this is like the Sears of Israel. All right, so Sears, fairly large chain, Mashbil, on their primary computer, on the primary computer system, they had root. And somebody found it out, which is fine. So they war dialed and they found the dial-in for that computer and they got scared. So they posted the number for the Mashbil Merkazi, the central computer, they posted it as a BBS on a BBS list. And the reason was to have other people discover that root is possible and basically cover their tracks. So, and for a full year and a half, it was listed on a BBS, on one of the BBS lists as an open BBS for the community. And I mentioned that one of the ISPs went bankrupt, 95. So that ISP is called DataServe, obviously no longer with us. The CEO of the DataServe was called Gil Bin Noon. His password is IMGBN1. Maybe we should apologize years later. And the interesting thing is, how was that discovered? Just remember the old days. It was /dev/nit. You could listen in on the network interface, and that was clear text being posted. So DataServe was absolutely open for a fairly long while.
So how did we learn? Back then, there wasn't internet. We actually had to buy books and sometimes wait for them for a long time because you went to the store, either it was there or you didn't know it existed. The thing on the left you see, Machshevet, those were very elementary books. I think many of us started our computer education there. That was mostly basic and sometimes Logo and Pascal. I learned assembly language from the book in the middle and Pascal from the book over there. And that led rather quickly, at least with the curious guys, to reverse engineering, because we wanted to know why things happen, how they happen, and how we can modify them to our benefit. One of the reasons we did that was to contribute back to the community. There was also a community back then, if you guys recognize this. This is the Ralph Brown interrupt list. Back then, this was like the holy grail of interrupts on the 8086 platform. And I made some contribution. I would reverse engineer my BIOS. I don't know why I did that, but I did. And then one day, Eden comes to me, already back then he was delegating, and he said, Inbar, how about you write a piece about anti-debugging tricks? And I actually did, not entirely by myself. And actually, this can be found all over the internet. Back then, we didn't think that the stuff was going to be recorded, but complete archives of emails and echo mails are somewhere to be found. And this is all over the internet, and we have an exclusive. We're going to release the 6th edition that was never actually published. I actually found it in my stuff. Now, reverse engineering was not only code. These are 2 games by Microprose. I liked flight simulators. My dad used to be a pilot. And it turns out the engine on these 2 games is identical, which means that all the data files are identical. Now, they didn't have the same places you could fly. Right? One of them had the Persian Gulf and the other one had, South Africa. And you wanted to do both. So we figured out that you can just copy the files and then enjoy all the arenas in the same game.
So games were a major part of growing up, much like everyone here. And this guy is one of the biggest contributor to that in Israel. I showed this picture initially, Asi Azulai, one-man crew, the really the original zero-day meaning of it, which is these are the latest wares that you can find. And that was on his BBS. Now, the problem is, or the thing that was really annoying, is that he was putting in intros, demos before the games that he was distributing. And that was really annoying, right? So, just to take credit. So, we instrumented the code and found which bytes to change, to jump, and just to get rid of that. And that started a war. And, well, here I can say we. That's this kind of a we. So we found how to reverse engineer that and remove that code, but then they added self-modifying code and encrypting the intro, which was a real bummer. So what we did, if people hear code assembly, we actually captured int 10. Int 10 is the changing into mode 13, which was the VGA mode, because they needed that to do the demo. And we just sent failure. So never mind how he encrypted the code, never mind what they did, the demo just wouldn't come up. And as soon as then the game goes and does mode 10, mode 13, and in 10, fine, yeah, go ahead, let's play the game.
And we called it, as you can see, Asi. Now, Asi wasn't the only one using file compressors. There were many of them. You had ICE and PK Lite, and some of them had versions that didn't have extractors. And one of those was TinyProg. TinyProg was created by Alex Robinson, and there was no decryptor for that. So I wrote one, also not entirely by myself, and it actually worked. And back then, when you contacted someone, it was by sending them a letter. I actually found a guy. His company was called Transoa. I sent him a letter, and he kindly asked me not to give the source away. He said, "This is how I make my income. Please don't spread it because people buy the product and I wanted to keep working." And I actually agreed. And at a certain stage...
Yeah, I was cracking games for a living. If you played Larry Sweet Larry VGA edition. So TinyProg was a problem. And so Inbar was visiting me one day and I found the source code and I copied that over.
Stole it, you mean?
Yes. Well, copying, zero cost. And then the crazy amazing thing is that we did have the relationship in place for him to, just before leaving, say, I just want to run something on your computer. And he did a find to the file size, the byte file size of TinyProg, and found it on my drive. Oh, so, but that did start a fight, right? So,
a friendly fight.
A friendly fight. So this is a crack for a software called Olin. Olin was the primary typewriter in Israel at the time, and they had a really good protection system. It was actually a parallel port driver that you'd put in, and it had part of the challenge response. It had part of the code in it. And so, because Inbar was refusing to give me TinyProg on TinyProg, so I wrote OpenAll. OpenAll was an x86 virtual machine that would emulate the running of the software, find when to capture the executable, but also log the parallel port. Hence, the crack to Olin. The interesting thing, like we found all these while doing the research for this. The interesting thing is, I guess you all know Frack. Right? That's one of the holy Bibles. And Herd Beast, who I have no idea who that was, wrote a summary about the Israeli scene. Now, if you look back, see, this is Fort Prefect, that was me, HASP was my group, and Frack is talking about, for the sake of the pirates, an Israeli foreign group that also has American members is called HASP. HASP was a group of one. No American members whatsoever, but I did have a Frack mention. So from all those cracking started a new community called the demo scene in Israel. It was mostly in Europe. There wasn't much of a demo scene in the US, which is interesting. And at one point I became the coding coordinator of ICE, the Insane Creator Enterprise, which up until that point were just creating ANSI. So we were the first VGA coders on that platform. And you see that he's actually crediting 3 Israelis that joined the group at that point. And this is one, Tom Tsarfati, one of the best engineers I know to this date, and an entrepreneur in a group called Simply. Nitzan Shaked, he now is one of the leaders of what was Yahoo in Israel, and that was me. But the interesting thing is that we were clueless at the time that there was another group, or a group of people. There were about 24 people that were doing demos in Israel, but we're not communicating with one another. So these people are awesome engineers to this date, and this guy is one of the best mod and S3M trackers to date, and he's part of a group called Infected Mushroom, if people know. Yeah. So that was the demo scene, right? It's pretty crazy seeing that from the guy, Erez Eisen.
The virus scene was a very interesting place to be in the 90s. And Israel did play a role also in the virus writing, let's call it scene. The most famous two are the Jerusalem and the Haifa. Remember, we're talking back then, there was a distinction between a virus and a worm and a Trojan. So these two. There were some local initiatives. People wrote malware to inject cuss words into their school computers. But most of what we were doing in Israel was actually on the good side. If you look at the antivirus history, you can see that a lot of companies were actually based in Israel. One of these companies, one of the writers, Gilad Yafet, is the co-founder and CEO of MyHeritage, one of the largest genome mapping companies, was it? So some more from my collection, these are actually floppies of AVs. This one is by Iris, and we had VirusSafe as well. And there was actually one that was written by 2 guys, Yuval Tal and Uzi Appel. You can see on the right, Yuval Tal writing in one of the EchoMail channels that he's looking for some assistance. And then Uzi Appel joined the military, so I was called in to replace him. So for a while I was actually writing AV engines, and that was 92. And an interesting story, the Haifa virus, I actually found it on my school computer. And it was the first, or one of the first, that was self-encrypting, self-modifying. It was very, very advanced at the time. And I did a complete reverse engineering of that. And I hope you can see what it says. I'm so proud of myself. Just read the first sentence, really. It's pure gold. And I created the generic signature and I sent it to the AV company. And the interesting story is that not so many years later, I ended up serving in one of the units in the military, and one of my colleagues admitted that he was the guy who wrote the virus. So it's a small world. This is the signature. It was very interesting. Now, as far as carding goes, I'll just say a few words. There were 2 big engines called CBI and TRW. They had a lot of credit information. They were completely unprotected. Many people had access to that, and they shared that. There was some ethical line in Israel between, getting information and trading it and actually using it. Using other people's credit card was frowned upon. And let's also talk about some famous busts. Deri Shreibman, he was the first casualty in Israel. He was caught back in 91. It was the first time that the police actually tackled this whole thing that we were doing. It was said that he had technology that was never seen before by law enforcement. We had the analyzer. This guy didn't learn from his mistakes and actually fell back into crime a number of times. And someone told me this week that he might actually be in custody as we speak. This is a story from Eden.
Yeah, it's so this guy was caught because he put a Trojan on his ex-wife's machine, who then suspected because he had information that he shouldn't have had. Interesting story, but then that actually blew up, and it apparently more than 8 different private investigators in Israel used the same Trojan in order to steal data from the largest corporates. So by him being stupid and putting it on his ex-wife's computer, he actually destroyed his own business, which was selling it to law enforcement, to private investigators.
And the last one, a guy from Ashkelon, this is actually a minor. This happened in the States. He was making bomb threat calls, got arrested. Recent history, many of these people ended up in military intelligence. The pioneer generation actually brought the knowledge with them. The younger ones picked it up there. And Checkpoint was the first companies that was founded based on stuff that people learned in the military. This happened in '93, and you can see a long list of companies that were formed by military colleagues, people who met in the army and had comradeship, and they shared, work and knowledge, and they trusted each other. And this brings us to where they are now.
Yeah, so we go through this whole story, and then, let's see. So this is one-man crew, right? He's now running a big IT shop, nothing big. Guy just sold his company 2 weeks ago to Symantec for $250 million. Lior founded the company, which I was fortunate enough to fund, and was the CTO of Get before that. This is actually Inbar's ex-boss, who runs Perimeter X. Yair went off to found ICQ, and then Dotomi, and he now runs AppCard. Yaniv L-Slasher, the guy with all the lyrics, is one of the top AI researchers now at Facebook. He was my co-founder at Face.com. The analyzer got caught again and again and again, and in jail. Deri is actually running Hola. If you use VPN, the free VPN, hugely scalable, which is pretty crazy. And Erez, well, Erez is with
Tara Reid.
Tara Reid. So it comes to show you that was? See, we're not up to date. Okay. Sorry, apologies. But the musicians always get the good stuff.
And that's it. This book happened. That's why everybody knows the term Startup Nation.
That's the Israeli culture. Disrespect for authority, willingness to fail, live today as there might be no tomorrow. That's the culture.
And we're 32 seconds off. Thank you.
Thank you.